Hello everybody. I'm the last speaker of the last session on the last day of this symposium. I will just summarize it very briefly. Depression is the flu of psychiatry. It's one of the most common disorders that we encounter. If there is a cognitive executive impairment, it has an impact on the social life as well as the working life of the individual. The data are not consistent. We will see them together. What are we going to talk about? What are the cognitive and executive functions? The transaction where the neurobiology of depression, neurobiology and cognitive executive functions overlap, the cognitive and executive functions during an episode, and the ones during remission. When we assess neuropsychological impairment, the cognitive and the executive functions are taken together in the literature in almost all the publications. It's not only about the cognitive functions, they are usually associated with the executive functions because they are more detailed, more comprehensive. Memory, learning period, attention, and awareness, and executive functions. Executive functions in the real life are the problem-solving skills and to adapt to different situations. And to improve on these functions, the outside world needs to be observed very carefully. We need to focus our attention. We need to be able to recall the information from the long-term memory, and we have to integrate all of it to make a decision. What do we need to fulfill these functions? We need a cognitive flexibility. I have defined it. It's to be able to think flexible under variable environmental conditions. We need to be able to initiate different functions and actions. We need to be able to plan and organize in a logical sequence in the target's direction. We need to sequence everything. We need to be able to filter. Non-functional and external factors need to be filtered, which are not to the end that we have in our mind. Attention. And then we need to be able to observe, and finally we have the processing memory. These are the most important components of cognitive functions. If you look at the neural circuits about cognitive functions and executive functions, it's quite similar to the previous definition. All the functions need to work in harmony. There are many areas in the brain that play a role, and the mechanism that plays a role is called executive control. The center of executive control is the prefrontal cortex. But this is only a command center. The executive functions, as it was described by Dr. Volkan, with the basic article of Alexander, it was defined for the first time. We have this loop which goes to the striatum, to thalamus, and then back to the DLPFC. Major depressive disorder, when you perform some imaging studies, dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and DMPFC have been shown to be reduced in volume. The ACC, especially the subgenual region, is reduced in volume. The volume reduction is also observed in the thalamus, striatum, and hippocampus. The areas where there is volume reduction is within reduced metabolism, which also include DLPFC, and in the resting stage we have activation in DLTPFC. We have an increased activity during depression, and other areas where the metabolism decreased are ACC, thalamus, striatum, basal ganglia, and hippocampus. So what is the meaning of all of this? The executive functions, basically, in normal individuals, are the areas including DLPFC and cingulate gyrus, and this also is true for depression. What kind of conclusion can we draw from it? And as I said before, during the depressive episode, we have an abnormal signal input to the amygdaloid nucleus, DLPFC and ACC. This signal input mediated by abnormal projections, it leads to cognitive impairment and forms the basis for executive functions. This metabolic disorder in the amygdala is also maintained during remission. If there's an impaired function performance during this stage, we have a hypothesis to explain it. Persistent increased activity may interfere with the executive functions. Especially the study of Harrison is very comprehensive. There is a vicious cycle. What do we mean by that? The hyper or hypoactivation in the critical subcortical areas impairs the arrangement of the prefrontal cortex inputs, and the pathological inputs lead to persistent unstable hypo and hyperactive situation, which also supports our hypothesis. So what does reduced DLPFK activity mean? The less this activity is, the more intensive depression gets. And also, process memory is impaired. There's a regression in conceptual changing and planning capability, and perseveration, especially in the Wisconsin twinning test. The LPFK function is closely correlated. The DLPFK and AFPFK have important functions, especially it's important in the generation of the emotions. There are different areas. The dorsal area is for cognitive data, and the ventral part is usually associated with emotional processes. The one about cognitive functions, in order to rank the emotions, and the attention area is part of the attention network, to focus your attention, to be able to identify the errors, and responsible for the executive function, and at the same time it is also associated with motivation. How about reduced ACC activity? What does it lead to? It leads to a reduced motivation, it reduces the attention span, and it reduces the psychomotor speed. During an episode in depressive patients, there is an impairment or in the executive functions, and this has been investigated in many studies. Here we have only a selected list of these studies, and some studies report an impairment in the executive functions. In some other studies, no impairment has been reported. There is an inconsistency. The basic reason is due to the study design in terms of sample selection. In most of the study, there is no discrimination between bipolar and unipolar disorders. Comorbidities are not excluded. The disease intensity is not defined. Remission is not identified, and it's also not reported whether medications are used. ECT history is not identified, and some special symptoms are not reported, such as psychotic ones. General acceptance for the studies that report an impairment is that there is a negative effect on the cognitive and executive functions. Especially episodic memory is a function of the, and it could be one of the reasons of this impairment. Really, the data are inconsistent. And about the executive functions, there is a delay in the reaction time, and which is a consistent finding of all the studies. From the cognitive functions, it is rather an executive function impairment, especially in the young adults. This has been emphasized by Grant. What is the association between the impairment in cognitive function and executive function impairment and the depression intensity? In 11 studies, such a correlation has been reported. In 9 studies, no such association could be identified. Then this question pops in our minds, whether the observed cognitive impairment is due to motivational deficiency, or is it just a secondary finding? This is still controversial. Austin and Marcella have studied melancholic and non-melancholic depressions. The data are quite consistent, especially in melancholic depression. The working memory, switch of attention, and perseverative responses are more severe in non-melancholic depression. Karabikiroğlu from Marmara University has conducted a study. This study has not been published yet. I would like to thank him for allowing me to present it here. And he compared the executive functions and depression's first episode depression patients and recurrent depressive attack patients. The patients have not received any medical therapy. Maybe the ones who had previous episodes may have had drug therapy, but right now the patients are not on any medication. In the recurrent depressive episode group, the perseveration scores are higher, verbal fluency is more severely impaired, and continuous performance tests in the recurrent depressive episode group are more severely affected. This is what happens during episodes. What happens during remission? There are some studies on remission. They are not consistent either. Lampe and his co-workers have conducted a study, and they have shown that the executive functions are also impaired during the remission state. Just the opposite is claimed by Bringer and his co-workers, and there is in the remission stage that the executive functions are normalized. There's another study by Nakano and his co-worker. And here, older patients, geriatric patients and younger patients are compared. In the geriatric patient population, it is mostly associated with a vascular abnormality, and the verbal fluency is more severely affected. And of course, previous medical therapy and ECT effects are not excluded, which are the shortcomings of these studies. When I scanned the literature in terms of planning and design, this is one of the best studies I could find in terms of design. This is from Palika Haberman, published in 2005. The patient population consists of 40 people. They are all in remission. They are euthymic. 20 patients had up to 2 depressive episodes, and 20 people had 3 or more severe depressive episodes. Attention and executive functions were investigated, and 3 areas were under focus. And there are healthy individuals there who were used as a control group, and this result contradicts with the idea that it's situational. The results appear to be continuous rather than instantaneous or situational. In the patient group with a higher number of episodes, especially planning and monitorization functions are more severely impaired. In conclusion, the data are inconsistent, and rather than cross-sectional studies, we need long-term observational